5.
The idea of the BBC trying to find ways of pleasing reform voters is just too delicious to ignore, really.
4.
The taste of cordite is in the air.
3.
In a scoop of analysis, I'm going to suggest that an awful lot of people tipped out of asylum hotels will soon be camping in a park near you.
2.
What we saw today in terms of the areas under her control, there are big question marks that need to be asked.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. We've just been listening to Rachel Reeves' spring statement, haven't we, co-pilot? Money's tight, and yet Rachel from Accounts has magicked up billions of pounds to give away in extra spending, throwing yet another bone to the Labour Party faithful, following orders not just from Deputy Prime Minister Red Queen Angela Rayner, but also Keir Starmer himself. Where's the money coming from, Alison? In the first instance, I'd say it's billions of pounds of extra borrowing. Who cares if the interest we pay on the UK's national debt's twice what we spend on defence each year, more than we spend on schools and transport combined? Let's just rack up even more debt, however much the market then jacks up borrowing costs, increasing those ruinous interest payments even more. And along with borrowing, Alison, Reeves is surely lining up more tax rises this autumn. No matter a tax burden already at a 70-year high, with the hikes we've already seen causing hiring to plunge and revenues to fall, as countless wealth creators leave the country, crippling growth and making our public finances even weaker. Robotic Reeves will keep putting up taxes and borrowing for ideological reasons, in a frenzied bid to bankroll ever more government spending, expanding the scope of our already extremely overbearing state. We'll talk about the budget allocations to health, to police and all the rest of it, Alison. And we'll do that with our excellent guest, leading economist and Telegraph columnist, Gerard Lyons. But the big question here for me, when Labour, the Tories and Reform are all championing ever more government spending, is who's standing up for reality. Before that, let's discuss your beloved homeland, Alison, where Nigel Farage has been this week, talking about revitalising the proud industrial heritage of Wales, a place that could prove pivotal to British politics over the next few years. But let's start with the advice that you offer in your latest Telegraph column, link in the show notes to this episode, to BBC Director General Tim Davie.
I feel like I do want to talk about the advice to the BBC because they want to become more reform friendly, Liam. Can you imagine we've come to this historic moment, having treated Nigel Farage and the Faragists as a horrible bad smell. Now they've got to start being nice to them because goodness knows they might be popular and form the next government. But if I'm sounding a bit distracted, it's because I'm still reeling from listening to Rachel Reeves. It's like, I mean, we're never going to be at Passchendaele, are we, Halligan? But we get a bit of a taste of what it must be like to be under enemy fire.
The taste of cordite is in the air.
Rattling off. I mean, what was that rubbish about? Anyway, we'll have plenty of time to dig into the fine print, which I know Gerard Lyons is going to be expertly analysing for us.
We will, to come on to that. But even Paul Johnson, who I think is probably the most widely respected fiscal economist in Britain, of course, who runs the Institute for Fiscal Studies, no friend of the Tories at all, but he actually tweeted during Rachel Reeves' speech, "Not sure I've ever listened to a Chancellor's speech so hard to work out what's happening," rattling off huge numbers of figures, making it look like big increases in spending on everything. And Gerard and I watched the budget together and we were just wondering, where are the announcements? It's all a bit vague. But as you say, we will come on to that because Nigel Farage has been doing impressions of Jones the Steam.
He certainly has. I think it's worth just dropping in because this is, you know, the famous Labour statement, a good day to bury bad news. And as Rachel was doing her machine gunning of taking down the British economy in her inimitable spending frenzy, we just popped up that Keir Starmer has just agreed to hand control of the Gibraltar border to Europe. So another treasonous act from our Prime Minister, hot on the heels of the Chagos Islands deal. So I'm sure they've slipped that out, Liam, to try and avoid all the fury that they're going to attract. But yes, Nigel, now let's say what you like about Nigel, but he can pronounce Llanelli. He said it properly.
Llanelli.
The first English leader I've heard pronouncing my hometown well. Reform, as we've discussed quite a lot, haven't we, on Planet Normal, revving up now for the Senedd elections next year. And I predict, Liam, that May the 7th is going to be an astonishing day in British political history, and Reform very much hoping to kick Labour, which has held sway in Wales, causing absolute destruction in Wales. If you want to know what a Labour government can do, you just have to look at Wales, see what they've done to Wales. But Farage was there in Port Talbot, in fact, where the great steelworks was closed not long ago. The mighty pair of blast furnaces turned off. And he was talking about the reindustrialisation of Wales. A lot of people would say that's much too ambitious. It cost billions to turn those blast furnaces back on. But nevertheless, he was making very promising noises about, guess what, Liam? Using our own coking coal, people able to mine for our own domestic fuel to power our own steelworks and so on. So it was a very clever speech, very, very well placed. And I absolutely believe that if Reform can pull off this miracle, they're on about 25% now.
Behind Plaid,
which is on 30. Plaid, remember, which wants to turn my country into a sanctuary nation, which basically means importing thousands of ne'er-do-wells from some of the most godforsaken places on the planet. I think the Welsh people may wake up to what that's going to involve. But if indeed the Welsh do back Reform, we will then see the most astonishing launching pad into the 28-29 general election. By the way, just a little reference back to Rachel's review. She actually delivered the phrase, "We did save British steel," Liam. I don't think the people in Port Talbot, I don't think the 2,500 jobs that went there felt that they'd been saved by Rachel Reeves.
It strikes me that Wales really could become a bridgehead for Reform in terms of politics more generally.
Yeah.
And you do feel that momentum is with them. I'll never know Wales the way you do, but I go there quite often. I talk to a lot of people in Welsh politics. And Plaid, for all their merits and all their dogged campaigning over the years, I remember Plaid in the days of Daffyd Wigley when they were sort of politically irrelevant. They are now, on current opinion polling, the most popular party in Wales. But they're kind of Welsh wokesters in chief, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're a bit like the SNP in that regard. And in that sense, you feel that kind of agenda is very much on the wane. Of course, we had the excellent Andrew Daw recently on Planet Normal talking about the end of woke. We don't think it's the end of woke, but we certainly do feel with the Supreme Court ruling and many other developments that kind of support is diminishing. And as you say, Farage's very strategic speech, really appealing to Wales' industrial heritage, will get a lot of hearts beating faster in Wales. And if Reform can literally take control in Wales, having run a bunch of local councils as they currently are for a year, it'll be like a two-stage, if you like, inauguration process. Rachel Reeves was keen to make fun of Nigel Farage in her speech. They're not serious. They've only been in Parliament for a year. But if they've run local councils and then they've run a whole country, that will mean that they can then pose as a more credible force come the general election in 28-29. And as you say, that would be politically seismic. I mean, Labour have basically run Wales for a century. And in recent years, of course, you know, what were previously gold standard across the UK, schools in Wales, the NHS in Wales, of course, the NHS originally created by Nye Bevan. Under both those key headings, Labour-run Wales has, I'm afraid, been very much lagging behind a lot of the rest of the UK compared to its previous high standards. And that's almost unanswerably true on all metrics. That is true. Do you genuinely believe that Reform, Allison, could become the biggest party in the Welsh Parliament?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And I think that I remember being on Question Time just before the Brexit referendum, Liam, and being jeered by the usual fair and balanced BBC audience. And I said, my country is going to vote firmly to leave the European Union. And I was shouted down. That was the famous occasion. I think actually Farage was on that panel. That was the famous occasion, Liam, when I'd asked the producer before if there would be another woman, because I quite like being on a panel if there's another woman. And they said, oh, yes. And I turned up and the other woman was Eddie Izzard. But they were wearing a pink beret. So when I said, where is the other woman? They said, oh, when Eddie said yes, we stopped looking for one. And you wonder why the BBC has fallen in people's estimations.
Well, you've now been giving them advice, haven't you? You've been giving advice to Tim Davie and the BBC chairman, Samir Shah, because they've been holding this internal meeting, they let it be known, about how they can be a bit nicer to reform. I mean, imagine the script writers of W1A, that brilliant,
yes,
to the BBC's credit, commissioned by the BBC sitcom where the BBC gently mocks itself. But of course, so many people at the top of the BBC, many of whom we know personally, they detest reform. They say reform is completely divisive. They're far right. And as you say, Alison, every time a BBC journalist uses the phrase far right to describe reform, they should be using the phrase far left to describe, many members of the Labour front bench.
Well, there's not much to entertain us at the moment, Halligan, but I really do think that the idea of the BBC trying to find ways of pleasing reform voters is just too delicious to ignore, really. So I did suggest that they should bring back Jeremy Clarkson and basically use him in everything from Call the Midwife, Spring Watch and the sewing contest, just to araldite a few reform voters to that. And also, actually, a little slightly more serious suggestion was to stop the relentless and silly patronising diversity casting of BBC drama. I mean, it's absolutely just got beyond parody now, because in any police procedural, Liam, you'll have noticed that all white police officers are always married to a spouse from another ethnic identity, which, as we know, doesn't really represent the country we live in, but it certainly represents the planet that most BBC producers do exist on.
And you said the BBC, I think this is a very serious suggestion. The BBC should, of course, I completely agree with you, buy the rights to all England test matches. So football is our national sport, of course, as is cricket. I think football's a lot more complicated. It's a lot more hotly contested commercially, but certainly cricket, all England test matches should be on the BBC, as you rightly say, not least because many older reform voters may struggle to afford a Sky subscription and watch the game that they love. I think that's exactly right. You made some other slightly more tongue-in-cheek suggestions, like instead of Billie Piper being Doctor Who, it should be her former husband, Lawrence Fox, who is, of course, an actor who, having been on Question Time and saying that, in his view, the UK wasn't racist, it was actually a very tolerant country, a view that I agree with, he then found that his acting work dried up.
Well, I think Lawrence, actually, joking aside, would been an absolutely brilliant Doctor Who. He has all the sort of mercurial qualities to be a Doctor Who, and we've seen that great cult classic show run into the ground by ever more increasingly mad woke ideas. And The View, is my son now in his 20s, but was an absolute, we couldn't go anywhere on a Saturday because it was all building up to Doctor Who, and those were in the great days of, exactly. Christopher Eccleston, I thought, was absolutely extraordinary.
I will always be a John Pertwee man.
Oh, yeah.
I will always be closely followed by Tom Baker.
Oh, Tom Baker was
Tom Baker was good with his long scarf and his jelly babies.
Yeah, Tom Baker was wonderful as well. But there's a serious point here, isn't there, that BBC news bulletins, how often do we turn on and think, you and I think that the story selection is absolutely astonishing, bears no resemblance to what anyone's talking about down the pub at all. And it's never a BBC bulletin without climate change editor Justin Rolat, is it really? So if they want to win over Reform, Liam, they might have the odd person on the news suggesting that green taxes, which are driving poor British people to have the highest fuel energy bills in the developed world, that's not what Reform voters want at all. So, I think, all credit. Let's just see if the panic in Broadcasting House now, as they figure out that we knuckle dragging far right extremists. By the way, something this week, I mean, I don't know if you saw a very, very powerful front page of The Sun, the annual hotel bill for illegal migrants /asylum seekers is now £4.7 billion. Very good stat from The Sun. Every single penny in tax and national insurance from Greater Manchester is paying to accommodate tens of thousands of young males who entered our country illegally. Now, if we'd been pointing that out, Liam, a couple of weeks ago, we would just have been called racist. But the good news is we've been promoted, because according to Prevent, the counter-terror organisation, we aren't racists anymore for being worried about immigration. We're terrorists. Yes, terrorists.
Is that a promotion? I don't know.
It is a promotion, I think it's. Anyone daring to express cultural nationalism, doubts about uncontrolled immigration and lack of integration, puts us in the company of all the merry 43,000 jihadists who are on the MI5 watch list. I was wondering how many people would now be classified as terrorists by Prevent. It's about 35 million, isn't it?
Absolutely insane. I agree. I thought that was a really good front page by The Sun.
Yeah.
That's what we call in journalism a scoop of analysis. It's not a scoop like a press release you got hold of before anyone else, or a brand new interview with somebody who's newsworthy. It's just eyeballing the figures, doing some sums and coming up with a really interesting statistic that absolutely nails an argument when all the tax collected in, effectively, apologies to Birmingham, the UK's second biggest city, certainly the capital of the North, are funding this one simple heading, a very emotive, emotion-stirring heading, then it really makes people sit up and listen.
And the stat that we'll be seeing reform hugely successful all around the country. And I thought it was interesting that Rachel Reeves, one of her sort of non-economic promises in this spending review was, we will be ending the use of asylum hotels in this parliament. And I thought, Rachel, where are you going to put the thousands of undocumented males? And then somebody pointed out that Angela Rayner is just overturning the Vagrancy Act. So rough sleeping will no longer be criminalised. So I think, Liam, in a scoop of analysis, I'm going to suggest that an awful lot of people tipped out of asylum hotels will soon be camping in a park near you.
Now on to our Planet Normal guest, Telegraph columnist Dr. Gerard Lyons, one of those rare beasts, a PhD economist who can actually write and talk in coherent sentences. Great to have you back, Gerard. You and I wrote a book together, of course, a few years ago, Clean Brexit, published by Biteback, and we stay in touch comparing notes on economic policy making more generally. During your time as a leading city economist, you were previously chief economist at Standard Chartered, among other roles, you developed a well-deserved reputation as a canny economic forecaster. And you've also forayed into politics, having been chief economic advisor to Boris Johnson when he was mayor of London. And there are plenty of serious people who think you'd make a pretty decent governor of the Bank of England. You're currently chief economist at the financial services company NetWealth, on the board of two city firms, Bank of China and BGC, and you're also senior fellow at the Centre of Policy Studies. We're delighted to have you with us, Jerry. You and I, we watched the spending statement together. What did you think?
Well, firstly, it's great to be back on the show. Thank you for asking me. Early in her speech, the Chancellor said, "Is the plan credible?" And the answer, unfortunately, is no. The starting position is debt is very high. And I think we're in the early stages, unfortunately, of Britain going into a debt crisis. If you're looking for good news, it might be that we're not the only country facing this problem. But today, the Chancellor gave a speech that I think lacked a lot of the detail. If I was looking at this with a financial markets head on and not a Westminster hat on, and I say that because I think her speech was very much aimed at the backbenchers and those in the rooms. It had more of a Westminster feel. The number of parts of the UK, important parts of the UK that were mentioned was quite significant. But she needed up front, in my mind, to allay the fears of the bond market.
I agree.
And I don't think she did. She didn't put that context there at the beginning. She did, of course, allude to the fact that growth recently has been the highest in the G7. It is, based on that quarterly data. She alluded to the fact that wages are now rising by more than inflation. They are. So there was nothing wrong with that. But the reality is that debt levels are very high. Growth is modest. Interest rates, even though, as the Chancellor said, they're falling, policy rates, they're likely to settle at a high level. And in recent weeks, it should not have gone over her head that bond yields in the UK are both high and rising, as indeed they are globally. But the global backdrop is one where Britain, like France, of the G7, depends more on foreign investors to buy its debt. So she had one key message in my mind to keep the markets on side. In her mind, I think she had a key message to keep the politicians on side. So from a financial market perspective, debt is high, growth is modest, rates are low, and that means that the fiscal numbers really do cause an area of concern. When you have basically modest growth and high interest rates, you have to actually sort of keep the fiscal numbers under control to prevent yourself going into a debt trap. The backdrop over the last year, after Labour won the election last year, was because they delayed the budget so much last year.
From July to October.
Yeah, it was crazy. We then saw the economy being talked down, and then we had a budget that delivered higher spending and consequently higher borrowing and higher taxes. The markets now think that after today, we could have a rerun of last year. Everything will now be geared to the budget later this year, partly because this fiscal event didn't have all the detail that one would like alongside it. The OBR is absent, so we've got to now wait to the autumn. And between now and then, lots of people, including myself, will say, I'm not quite sure she's going to be able to deliver these numbers. So therefore, in the autumn, dependent on what the OBR says, as we have back-to-front economic policy making in the UK. If the OBR, and I think the OBR do a great job, the OBR will make an economic forecast, the projection over the next few years. That will then be determined by the Chancellor whether it meets her fiscal rules. Then she would take action in the autumn budget. And after today's events, you have to say the numbers really aren't that credible. Why? There's 5 ways out of a debt problem. Let's assume you don't inflate the debt away. It's grow, reform, austerity, tax, borrow. Growth is modest. Reform of the public sector is necessary, but it will take some time. So we come back to those other 3 areas: taxation, borrowing, and austerity or the spending. And today we saw the austerity or the spending focus. What we saw in terms of the envelope was what the Chancellor had announced in the last budget, that the spending envelope is relatively tight, 1.2%. And what we saw today...
Real terms annual increase.
Yes, sorry, real terms annual increase over
real terms
each year.
After inflation, annual increase, by the end of this Parliament.
Over the next 3 years, starting... Well, the key figures today, 25-26 up to 28-29.
Yeah.
Then, against that backdrop of that envelope, she then today announced how the different pieces of the pie were going to be distributed. Health is up 2.7%.
Yeah.
So a big increase. But bear in mind... on day-to-day spending, this is, since the first comprehensive spending review in 1998, the average spending day-to-day increase for health has been around 3.4 to 3.5%.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So today's...
This is below the historic average
below
increase.
The historic, slightly above maybe last few years, but there's a lot of catch-up there the last few years.
Very interesting.
So health gets it. Defence, of course, up 3.8%. So health and spending are big parts. Education is up 0.8%.
Quite meagre.
Yeah, meagre, below the average. The areas that are squeezed, housing, community, local government, down 0.6%. A lot of pressure on local governments persisting.
Given that she wants to give more to housing, on social housing.
Foreign and Commonwealth Office, this is absolutely farcical. To actually cut the Foreign Office budget in real terms by 8.3%. Personally, I think it's wrong.
No more cucumber sandwiches in far-flung embassies.
No. Look, I go to Asia a lot. A few years ago, because of a spending review, the British sold off the embassy in Thailand. It was dropped down dead gorgeous. It was a place that had...
a very significant emerging economy, as you know well.
And what most people in London didn't appreciate was how that was received across not just Thailand, but the region. Yeah. It was stepping back.
As China is stepping up.
When you have defence spending, you need to supplement this with soft power and diplomatic power. Soft power has been squeezed with the ODA budget being cut back. I know the Telegraph supported that. I wasn't such a big fan.
That's the aid budget, overseas development assistance.
I think it needed to be spent better, let's be quite frank, and probably could have been trimmed. But the diplomatic budget, wherever you're coming from, that should be high. The other areas, Justice Department was up 2%. And the other big area that was hit hard was the Home Office, which probably explains why they were the last department to sign off on their spending
minus
review.
1.4% for the Home Office.
Right. And one thing that wasn't mentioned today was public sector pay, which is the other area that I think is quite interesting, because in the March budget, the OBR talked about employment going up by 0.6% per annum over the rest of the department. Now, if you assume that public sector employment increases in line with that, so it doesn't
become a bigger proportion,
but it probably
stays at about 21% of all employment.
And if the public sector wage bill rises in line with the overall spending figures today of 1.2% for public sector pay, my back of envelope figures suggest that the average pay awards would have to be 2% in cash terms in the public sector, which is below what the private sector is currently paying.
Yeah.
It's below the recent norm in the public sector.
Plenty of strike action this
and
summer.
And it's below the history of the public sector. So there are bits of here that, in my mind, coming back to the question I posed, is it credible? The question the Chancellor asked, no, because I don't think spending is going to be kept under control. I think the variables outside her control, growth and interest rates, leave areas of concern. Growth could be modest, could be very weak. Interest rates might not fall that much. But what we saw today in terms of the areas under her control, there are big question marks that need to be asked.
And before we bring in the leading economist on this podcast, Allison Pearson, it strikes me that you pretty much agree with Mel Stride. We listened to the Shadow Chancellor who spoke after the Chancellor's a spend now, tax later review. A cruel summer of speculation awaits as people expect tax rises to come in the autumn, but maybe also a summer of industrial dispute, if indeed your surmising on public sector pay is true.
Well, there were some positives. I'll give you some positives in a moment. But in answer to your question, I thought the Shadow Chancellor responded very effectively and it covered many of the key issues. And so in answer to your question, there are tensions. It really does depend on the growth picture. And one has to ask whether the economy is in the position enough to sort of make us feel really upbeat.
And if we get growth, we'll get the tax revenues, the fiscal situation will become stronger because of that growth.
Yeah, so coming back to those 5 areas, growth, reform, tax, austerity or borrow, the key is growth. Now, unfortunately, if we have a repetition of last summer, where there's this build-up to the budget, where there's a fear that the budget could deliver increased taxation or indeed higher borrowing that keeps longer-term yields significantly high, then that might dent confidence. And given that I often say that the outlook for the economy depends on the interaction between the fundamentals, policy and confidence. The fundamentals are mixed, but there's not much room for manoeuvre. There are still pockets of strength in this economy, no doubt about that. Policy isn't really, in my mind, on the fiscal front, helping the economy that much. And confidence is the big unknown. And there's no doubt in my mind that the consequences of last autumn's budget in terms of the tax on jobs and the sort of direction of travel since in terms of employment, other legislation, is denting consumer and business confidence. Consumer confidence has bounced back from its lows because people are seeing real terms pay increases, but it's not going to bounce back high enough given this backdrop for the economy.
I think our 2 junior economists there in the studio are being a bit respectful here. I thought that was a monstrously disingenuous performance by Rachel Reeves. I mean, I know, to borrow Late Alan Clark's great phrase about politicians being economical with the actuality. She's just lying, Jerry. She and Starmer have said that the reversal of the reinstating of the winter fuel allowance is possible because we've stabilised the economy, we've fixed the foundations. That's just not true. We know it's not true. And we're already now starting to see the impact that Liam and I have discussed on Planet Normal on employment and on businesses. We know that the payrolls have fallen, that's employment fallen by over 250,000 since Rachel Reeves's budget. Employment fell in May alone by 109,000. This is not an economy where you should be taking what seems to be like the gambles that she's taking. Where is the growth going to come from? Where is the money going to come from, except from further borrowing when we're already paying £110 billion interest on this absolutely horrifying debt. She said, Rachel Reeves, Jerry, she said, I will never take those risks. Isn't this a massive risk, what she's done today?
Well, absolutely. And indeed, in answer to Liam's first question, I said, is the plan credible? And I don't think it is. I don't think the growth is going to be there. The reforms in the public sector, well-intentioned, will take some time. Taxation is already incredibly high. The tax take is rising. Borrowing is already very high. Just recently, we've had to see an upward revision of the likely borrowing from the market this year. So the market is already digesting around £300 billion worth of gilt issuance this year, which is a huge number. So it then comes back to that key issue, what do you do on spending? And the message today on spending was that she wants to be tough, but the reality is the numbers I don't think add up. Now, what's the positive? Let's just balance it for positive on planning reform. I think that's really good. We need to see the details about public sector housing today. But while all that's pretty good, if you're a young person, you've been to university, you're now paying off a student loan at exorbitant interest rates, that pushes up your marginal rate of tax. You're then paying an exorbitant amount of money either to rent or to actually try and borrow somewhere. And then you don't actually have any sort of money on the side.
And if you want to do a little part-time job, if you're studying, you get pulled into the national insurance contribution net, makes it higher. Look at the hospitality industry shedding so many people because of that NIC rise, going down to £5,000 threshold.
Absolutely. The Chancellor on the positive today talked about investment, and she did last autumn. The figures are pretty low. We need to boost national savings to get investment up. She's talked about the pension funds doing more. Sounds great, but the fiduciary responsibility of people to run pension funds is to do what's in the best interest of pensioners.
I'm really worried about that. That's a side issue. I'm really worried about a government requisitioning pension funds, private savings for their own pet ideological projects.
And remember that the reason we're in this problem in the first place is Gordon Brown's tax rate.
Don't start me on that.
And then
the 1997 budget.
And then the subsequent hardwiring of regulations. So the net effect of that was to move pension funds away from investing in UK equities. And then they used stocks and shares. Then they bought a phenomenal amount of the UK market, probably close to half of it.
Yeah.
Now they're down to about 3 or 4%.
Yeah, it's crazy. Just let me unpack that sentence that you said, because there's a bit of jargon in there. We're battling to keep it absolutely accessible to all. What Gerard has just said there is really quite phenomenal. You know, not long ago, UK pension funds, they owned about half of the entire sort of panoply of UK stocks and shares across not just the FTSE 100, the FTSE 250 and so on. So ordinary people's retirement savings were going into productive resources, productive uses in British private companies that then employed people, which is how it should work. You've now got UK pension funds owning, 1/20th of UK stocks and shares, a completely twisted situation.
And today, actually, just following on from that, today the Chancellor talked about scale-up capital and British Business Bank being given more money, both very positive issues. But it's not for the state to be stepping in. If they actually stepped away in the first place, then the private sector would actually be doing this. Small firms suffer from a lack of patient and scale-up capital in the UK.
Long-term finance,
Once you start a company, first you've got to overcome the tax hurdles, the regulatory hurdles. The increase in national minimum wage that she touched on is a positive, naturally, for those receiving the wage. But many small businesses, the Federation of Small Business points this out, find it a real problem because it's leading to distortions in their whole pay structure. So the point is that even well-intentioned policy changes by the Prime Minister or the Chancellor or indeed the government, when you actually examine them in detail, they don't actually often solve the problem. And the reason we're in this problem often is because of these and previous interventions in the first place. The other, let's just say positive, one thing that was positive was the Chancellor talking about the regional dimension. Munitions changes recently to actually make sure more of that money went to small and medium-sized firms. Also talking about modular nuclear reactors. Positive. Finally. Now, we don't know the scale.
Has finally allowed small modular reactors to get off the ground. Rolls-Royce has had this technology for years.
But look, if you speak for 30 minutes, even if you spoke for 30 minutes about your love Manchester United, you'll probably find a few minutes of positive things to say. But we have to look at the whole 30 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's always important to say that if you're in control of what you say in the House of Commons, it would be a surprise if you didn't come out with some positives. But I think it's important to say that there are some positives. But when you step back, Alison's quite right, and your earlier comments are quite right, Liam. When you look at this in the whole, it's a worrisome policy statement.
I read with great pleasure, actually, co-pilot Halligan's Substack, When the Facts Change, Jerry, which I thought was a brilliant primer for the spending review. And Liam says the most ideologically left-wing government since the 70s is making even higher borrowing and spending commitments, cheered on by a medium class that is economically or often economically illiterate. And this really bothers me, because I think we're stuck now in a sort of loop where everybody says, oh, they haven't spent enough. Before they got into power, Labour said no more money for the NHS unless there's meaningful reform. Well, I've been paying attention. I haven't seen much meaningful reform yet. They've just bunged it another 30 billion. And also this reversal, which we've just seen on the winter fuel allowance, giving another 9 million people the winter fuel allowance. Only pensioners on 35 grand a year or more won't be getting it. Now, as it happens, I think that was a very clumsy, poorly applied policy. But does it not suggest, this very ideologically left-wing government, that they are not capable or indeed willing to make the cuts in this out-of-control public spending, which is really what's needed now to start to balance these really quite horrendous books?
I agree completely. And not only that, but even when they do try and control, they cut back in some of the areas where it could do with actually being left alone, actually, such as the Foreign Office budget, if I don't mind saying. But it comes back to the big issues. They're not prepared to take on the big spending areas, health, social security. Also, it's important to stress there are big structural changes taking place. The green agenda linked to that, energy costs. One can take the situation very seriously. The green agenda needs to be up there, but high energy costs is crippling the economy. So the nuclear issue needs to be given even a bit more oomph. AI, you need to be at the forefront. That's an area where you actually make the UK look attractive to entrepreneurs and wealth creators. Other measures are not doing that. So instead of being a government that should be trying to boost innovation, making sure the UK is more competitive and internationally attractive in which to invest, what we have is more tax, more spend and more borrow. And that's the unfortunate thing. And my takeaway from today is that the spending side is not going to be kept under control. And therefore that implies that if growth is not delivered and the reform that you've touched on is not delivered, and that's going to take some time, then it's undoubtedly from now to the autumn and the budget a focus on where's borrowing going to come from, i.e. who's going to lend us the money. And people will lend us the money internationally, but yields go higher.
At what cost? Yeah.
And it also means taxes go up. And then we're going to have the big focus on wealth taxes from now to the autumn. And wealth taxes are an area where we should probably have another, dare I say it, podcast on, because I think one really needs to focus on that, because the history of wealth taxes globally is that they do not yield the revenues expected. They're more likely to evolve into a tax on the middle class because high wealthy people are mobile. And what we've seen from the research that's been done justifying wealth taxes, I've delved into all the detail, it tends to hit those with business assets. And it's another problem in terms of making the UK less attractive for investment and wealth creation.
Can I ask both of you quickly? So you say that the markets will continue to lend us money, although at an ever higher rate. Does there come a point when the pips squeak? Is there you're not having any more? Sorry, we're cutting up your cards.
Yes. Britain and most of the G7 are heading for a debt trap. And a debt trap is equivalent to maxing out on your credit cards and not being able to pay the monthly interest rate payment. The criteria that needs to be in place for that is debt is bigger than the size of your economy, i.e. above 100% of GDP, and Britain's not far from that. We're heading in that direction. Second, your rate of growth is modest and is lower than your rate of interest you're paying on your debt forces you into a problem. And basically, our growth rate is less than the rate of interest we're paying on our debt. And that means that the government needs to run a primary surplus, bit of a technical term, but it means you need to run a surplus on your revenues over your spending, taking into account interest rate payments. We haven't run a surplus that often on the overall big picture stuff.
Not since 2001, I think was the last one.
We've only run 7 surpluses since 1969. In fact, 2001 is a very interesting analogy to use because when Labour won in 97, Gordon Brown inherited Ken Clarke's fiscal plans and he stuck to them for 3 years. And we then went from that famine to feast in terms of public spending. But he basically, in an environment where growth was pretty strong globally,
3-4%,
he kept to a tight fiscal plan, which basically earned him a sort of bit of credit in the eyes of the market. And debt levels were then below 40% of GDP.
Right.
So the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has come in with a growth picture that's worse than Labour inherited back in 97, a debt level sort of roughly 2.5 times higher.
Yeah.
And instead of learning the lesson, control the controllables, she hasn't done that, as we saw last autumn in the budget. And if you look at the detail today, you have to be concerned about her ability to control spending today. So the analogy with 2001 is an important one. She's not earned her spurs, so to speak. She instead has the fiscal rules. And obviously all this says that she has to stick to the fiscal rules because once you go down that path, it is the bizarre situation. But we have back to front policy making where these fiscal rules basically tie your hands and they're not really that credible in the first place. But we do need to bring debt to GDP down. We do need to control spending. My takeaway after today is that we're not going to achieve either.
Final question, Jerry. How do you think the opposition are doing? What do you think of Mel Stride's response? And what do you think in general about reform? Because reform now seem to want to be a big spending alternative to Labour across the red wall.
Okay, I try and not get into the party politics. You mentioned at the beginning, one of my affiliations is fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Yesterday, I delivered to them
a very prominent think tank.
A prominent think tank.
Broadly centre-right.
I delivered to them economic report on what we need to do in the UK. So it should be out in a couple of weeks. And it would argue that the first and most important thing we do is achieve fiscal credibility. And what you were asking about in terms of both the opposition parties, Conservatives and Reform, or the two opposition parties you asked about, I think they're actually addressing head on the issues that people want to talk about. And Allison talked a lot earlier about reform, but you asked a question particularly about the Shadow Chancellor. I thought he did a very good job today in terms of responding to this statement. You're in a really difficult position, as many previous politicians have said, if you're the Shadow Chancellor, because you only get a couple of shots at it a year and you don't always have the detail in front of you when you stand up and respond. But what we really need to see is a united front in terms of opposing some of the measures that we're seeing, because the key issue is to make the UK economy more attractive, because that's what we need to actually improve the rate of economic growth per head.
Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
And this is from James. Hello, Planet Normal. When did politics get so stuck? It seems to me that the political narrative is glitching, stuck on repeat, playing broken tracks and making us all dumb with the white noise of outdated lyrics. Austerity? What austerity? The general understanding of austerity seems to me to be that George Osborne and David Cameron presided over a period of cutting government spending in the early 2010s. The reality was that government spending increased every year. What they actually did was reduce the rate of increase. They built a narrative around austerity that was far more impactful than the reality. Improving public services? What improvement? More government spending, says James, relentlessly used as a proxy for improving public services. But we look around and don't see any improvement. Why? Well, I would suggest that increases in welfare payments don't make public services better. Increases in salaries, pensions, and even headcount don't improve public services. The link between what the government spends and the services provide is broken, yet our politicians continue to promise more spending. Cutting expenditure doesn't have to mean reduction in delivery of services that our leaders won't make the case. Let's every service provider off the hook. The spending review has become an exercise in negotiating budget allocation with threats of services and activities that will be cut by each department if they don't get the money they want. This framing should simply not be tolerated. Come up with a plan to deliver the same for less. Hell, why not deliver more for less? Lazy thinking is being given cover by lazy political narratives. Think that's radical? Well, it's precisely what Rishi Sunak and Rachel Reeves have done to business. Private enterprise, says James, of which I am a part, have had to figure out how to do the same and grow whilst having our resources curtailed by an unbelievable hurricane of headwinds. Corporation tax increases from 19% to 25%, interest rate increasing from 0.1% to over 5%, minimum wage increased by 40% since 2020, and employer national insurance increases. The level of disconnect between the political narrative, the reality of the situation, and the solutions required is disturbing. We will keep going in my business despite the failing state, but I do not know where this ends, says James.
Absolutely brilliant email there from James. A real kind of clarion call from the real world to Westminster policy making. This is from Richard, who's in Monmouthshire. Dear Alison and Liam. And Richard here is referring to the Shadow Chancellor, who, of course, was a guest on Planet Normal last week. When Rich wrote this, he won't have heard the spending review. Dear Alison and Liam, Mel Stride comes across as a very intelligent and knowledgeable politician. Were this 10 years ago, he would have been very compelling in his argument. However, says Richard, we're now in 2025 and sinking faster into quicksand than Britain ever has before. His considered arguments offer this former Conservative no comfort at all. Like thousands of your other listeners, I need compelling solutions to our current crisis. And the Conservatives, while they may have noticed the iceberg ahead, are still suggesting the best way to avoid it is by rearranging the deck chairs. No, what Mr. Stride said will not do. It's not enough, nowhere near enough. Yes, there's an opportunity for the Tories, given reform's seeming fiscal irresponsibility, but unless the Tories change their rhetoric soon, their rhetoric, not their leader, by the way, says Richard, they'll be frozen out of power for a generation. Liam, you did your best in the interview with Mel Stride on Planet Normal, and you were respectful, but I suggest even you must be frustrated at their refusal to face up to the existential threat staring right back at them. With all good wishes in these days of despair. I have been frustrated, Richard, though I must say I did think there was a bit more lead in Mel Stride's pencil today, to coin a phrase, in his response to Rachel Reeves. My beef with the Tories has been that they've been championing big spending at all costs, like a kind of speak your weight politician. And actually, there's a silent majority of people out there who are really worried about all the extra spending, who are really worried about indebtedness, who, you know, instinctively understand what Gerard Lyons has articulated on this week's podcast about a brewing debt crisis. And I thought there was more of a flavour of that in Mel Stride today at the dispatch box when we listened to the spring statement than there was actually in his Planet Normal interview with me last week.
Well, I think he was Mel Stride picking up a few tips from co-pilot Halligan. This is an email which has come in, Liam, to a response to a piece I wrote about why the police were threatening about the spending review, saying that if they didn't get any more money, they'd have to cut back on a number of police activities, to which most people said, what police activities? Because, of course, there's a mounting discontent with the police out there as they channel resources into thought crimes and hate crimes and not bothering to go and sort of solve burglaries and so on. But this email came in from a serving police officer, a PC anonymous, and you'll see why it's anonymous in a minute. I'm proud to have served my country for over 20 years as a police officer, and before that for 11 years in the army. I've worked extremely hard to be as good and fair an officer as I can be, doing my job without fear or favour, as I swore to do when I was attested all those years ago. I've never investigated anyone for a tweet. I wouldn't. I do not believe it would be lawful or proportionate of me to do so. I personally have a profound belief in freedom of expression and thought. Like many of my colleagues, I was deeply troubled by the COVID reaction and the impediment on freedoms. I never handed out a single COVID fine. I have, however, arrested murderers, rapists, paedophiles, violent thugs, burglars, thieves, shoplifters, and even illegal immigrants. And I've tried to rescue the vulnerable, talk people out of ending their own lives. And you should know that, in fact, policing is hard. It's incredibly hard. It's dangerous. It taxes the soul. It even kills some of us. I've pulled drowning crash victims out of rivers. I've been confronted by knife-wielding maniacs. I've stopped cars with a gun tucked down the side of the driver's seat. I've desperately tried to save people's lives with CPR on 20 or so occasions, which is one of the loneliest and most intimate ways to see someone die. I've been assaulted and hospitalized by the dregs of society, and all the time have returned to my duties as soon as possible because that's what I'm paid to do. It is thought that police officers witness 250 times more violence and trauma over their careers than most members of the public ever do. That exacts a huge toll. But in the past 5 years, Alison, things have slipped. In the last 3 years, I've had to sit through DEI training where I was told for an opening gambit, "We're not saying you're racist, but..." This training was mandatory and for new officers was made a mandatory requirement before they could be eligible for the incremental pay rises dictated in police regulations. I was fortunate to be at the top of my pay scale, so I ignored it. This training bleated on about my privilege and my whiteness and my toxicity and the clear implication that I was the problem. It did all this without really providing any evidence of these supposed failings and demanded that I had to be aware of my impact on others because of my apparent superiority complex and, quotes, unconscious bias. When I challenged this preachy, self-loathing ideology, I was called back into the office from the street and given dressing downs by senior ranking officers for having the temerity to think differently. For the record, I remain resolute in my belief that this was ideological indoctrination. My colleagues universally roll their eyes at it, and the training is universally reviled, but none will speak up for fear of censure. Pay is also a constant complaint, but not for the reasons you think. If I left the army now, from the rank and pay scale I had attained, I would not join the police on the current starting wage. It would simply not be worth it financially. So my place would be taken gleefully by an 18 or 19-year-old kid with no life experience. Police are not complaining about the pay for no reason. Experienced officers like me are profoundly worried because the pay is not attracting the right sort of people to replace us when we retire. It's not attracting ex-military and mid to late 20s people with a bit of life experience because many can't afford the pay cut to join. There is no resilience left in officers. It's been eroded by the system. There's no toughness. There's a profound fear of getting it wrong and paying the consequences as PC Lorne Castle did. I fought toe-to-toe with some real baddies in my career and even sworn at them as Lorne swore at the guy he was arresting. I'm less inclined to get involved now for fear of the thought police calling at my proverbial door. There are officers I know who've received complaints for the most trivial infractions and spent months, if not years, on what we refer to as brown shift or the naughty step. I cannot underestimate the risk I am running blowing this whistle to you. The Fed and the Superintendents Association are right that policing is in crisis. However, they fail to recognise that it is a crisis partly of their own making. The Federation is toothless and corrupted, not corrupt, but corrupted and unable to function properly, and is in some sort of self-preservation mode and unable to represent its membership effectively to the Home Office. From the coalface, the superintendents seem infected with the woke mind virus, and many, not all, seem to us to be more interested in virtue signalling and feather their own nests for the next ranks and conforming with the ideology in order to protect their own positions. The result is that good officers become expendable and absolute conformity is expected. The College of Policing that Alison mentioned is also widely reviled. Most of us see it as an organisation run by and for activists and infected by the woke virus. It seems utterly unaccountable to the people it professes to serve. And while some of what it does is useful, like standardised training, things like the Race Action Plan, which again seem to be an ecstasy of virtue signalling without any basis in fact, with no evidence, simply serves to make officers like me nervous of engaging with whole swathes of the community. I'm terrified for the future, says PC Anon. I'm not even sure I'll make my 30 years, not because I'm a wrong 'un, like some of those despicable Met officers who've done so much, damage to our profession. Because I might offend some child-minded officer inadvertently and be drummed out as a dinosaur, or upset a criminal I have lawfully and robustly arrested and lose my job. Alison, your article on the police was good. It hit right at my soul. I do still have one of those. I feel compelled to write to you because people need to know that most actual serving officers are utterly fed up with the politics intruding on our job, the intrusion of an incredible toxic ideology, the constant criticism, and the utter lack of understanding of just how brilliant, but also just how terrifying and sometimes utterly dreadful my job can be, and that most of us just want to be the public guardians of law and order we all signed up to be, and that the public wants us to be. Thank you. PC Anon.
Crikey. What an incredible email.
Incredible email.
After that really astonishing and important whistleblowing email there, Alison, let's end on a lighter note. It's been quite a grueling episode of Planet Normal.
It really has,
what with PC Anon and robotic Rachel from accounts, because Bob the Bard has struck again, the resident Planet Normal genius poet. I share Alison's concern that Labour has allowed itself to become captured by sectarian voting, says Bob. I shall never forgive those politicians who bargain away our democracy for short-term political gain. Thanks again for Planet Normal, and thank you for speaking out why we still can. Regards, Bob, quotes, former Bunk winner. And this is actually a Bob the Bard poem on a really serious subject, and it's called The Genie. When Labour feared that certain seats might one day slip its hold, it sought help from a genie that would do what it was told. O Genie grants us lots of votes upon election days. We promise to ignore your faults and look the other way. The Genie was obliging and the votes came pouring in, and Labour thanked the Genie for helping it to win. But the Genie's now the master, with its own list of demands, and Labour lacks the bottle to refuse what it commands. Very, very powerful stuff from Bob on that bombshell. That's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Huge thanks again to Dr. Gerard Lyons, friend of the podcast, economist extraordinaire. He even gives you a run for your money, Alison,
yeah, he does,
with your D in O-level maths. Jerry's got a PhD. He's got 3 degrees in economics. And I'm not talking about Prince Charles's, as he was, favourite singing troupe. Email of the week, it's my turn, and I think we need to give the email of the week to James for his superb email talking about politics being so stuck. So James, send us an email to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk, put mug winner in the subject heading and send us your postal address, and we will give you a Planet Normal mug in its own box through the post.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, do subscribe to this podcast. Leave us a rating and a review on Spotify. There's some very nice ones there. It does help others to find us, so the fantastic and incredibly sane Planet Normal family can grow.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal, the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers, Cass Ho, James Hodgson, Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.